critic is a creature who has views quite like a camel's. Flowers and fruit he scorns. In the flower garden of the honeyed muse, he starves unless he finds a meal of thorns. I just love that in the, critics were still getting slammed by poets like thousands of years ago. I love it. Today, we are talking about Susanna Clarke's novel Piranesi. I am here with Misha Grifka Wander, who is an academic, writer, and game designer. They received their PhD at Ohio State University, and he is currently based in Ohio with his partner and two cats. Misha is an editor at the Ancillary Review of Books, where, among other duties, they conduct delightful interviews with speculative fiction authors and scholars. I highly recommend reading Misha's recent interview with Sofia Samatar. And by the time this episode comes out, we'll be releasing one with Vajra Chandrasekhara. Misha, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Before we get into it, I wanted to ask, what else have you been reading?
I just finished Seth Dickinson's Exordia, which is I think first novel that is not related to the Baruch Cormorant series.
Yeah, I
Um,
think that's right.
I did not know what to expect and I was completely blown away by both the similarities in some way to the Baruch Cormorant series, where it's very well researched, very sort of meticulously detailed in terms of logistics and the ways in which systems work. And also, it takes place in our world and has a lot of sort of involvement with like the US's military campaigns in Kurdistan. So I did not know what to think of it and almost put it down for halfway through because it was difficult to read, but if you pick it up, I do think it's worth getting through to the end because there's a lot of violence, but it's also the most serious sort of exploration of the trolley problem that I think any philosophy student could ever hope for.
I am nodding and pumping my fist because I love this book. And yes, it is so much about the trolley problem. It's great. And about like just like realpolitik and like
Yeah.
the joke that is like game theory at the international level. Yeah, what if Michael Crichton wrote a book that was about aliens and Obama's drone program? Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, and it was also sort of harrowing and like what if Arrival, instead of trying to figure out people's language, it was like how do we figure out this thing while it is killing us?
hmm Yeah, yep. Super good. I've been waiting. I have a review for that coming out with Seize the Press that hopefully we'll see the light of day at some point here. But yeah, really fascinating book. Dickinson's just been an interesting author to watch, and I feel like not talked about
Yeah,
enough. So
I completely agree. And I mean people want science fiction to take on like big issues, big topics. That's exactly what he's doing.
yeah.
He's showing up.
hmm Yeah, it's really good. I've as always been reading like too much. I think the biggest standout for me recently is I just read Elwyn Cotman's collection Weird Black Girls,
Mm,
which is super good. Not a writer I had heard of before, and I want to go track down everything else now, but just really brilliant character studies, really good at capturing sort of like interesting, conflicted. A lot of the characters were like fairly young, like in their 20s, and in strange relationships, and many of them with like surreal or cosmic horror kind of science fictional elements.
yeah.
But was so good at capturing these characters that there were one or two stories that didn't have any overt supernatural elements, and I didn't
Mhm.
really notice until later because I was so fixed on the people in each one. Yeah, it was superb collection.
That's delightful. Yeah, I was recently reading Elaine Chow's Disorientations, which is
Oh,
not speculative fiction.
mhm.
Um, it is satire, and I always find satire to be like a challenging genre because I feel like we've reached an era in society where anything that is sort of ridiculous, people are like, "Oh, this is clearly satire." And I'm like, I'd bet money that someone believes this genuinely and full-throatedly would endorse it.
Yeah,
Um,
it's the Starship
yeah.
Troopers problem, right? Like
Yes.
the film, right? Like where the film is super obviously a satire of fascism as instantiated in America today, and people are just watching
Mhm.
like, yeah, this is great, kill the bugs. Like,
Absolutely.
hmm
Great. Sign me up.
Oh, I want one of those snazzy uniforms with the disturbing collars and epaulets. Love marching in patterns with my buds.
Yeah, I mean, I've just finished my PhD in English, and I'm sort of shaking the bars of my cage, being like, "This is why we need humanities professors."
Yeah, no, for
Some,
real. And I think, I don't know who said this. I've heard various versions of this, but that there actually is kind of like a thirst for literature and cultural interpretation that is
hmm
I'm shown by people latching on to like these weird conspiracies and fan theories and like odd deep dives on stuff that go in these strange, sometimes unhealthy directions. But it does show
Yeah,
that like people want to engage on a deeper level with, the media they are engaging with.
yeah, and people want narratives that are engaging and speak to their not only the realities of life, but the emotional realities of life. I
Hmm.
think the way that things feel beyond the sort of material.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that is why we're here. So we'll use
Yes.
that as an excuse to segue over. Today, we are going to be talking about Susanna Clarke's book Piranesi, which came out in 2020 from Bloomsburg. It was since adapted into a BBC radio adaptation read by Samuel Anderson. And I want to do a shout out to the audiobook by Chiwetel Ejiofor, just because it's phenomenal. It won the Audie Award for Best Audiobook the year it came out. Chiwetel Ejiofor, if you don't know, is a great actor with a really great reading voice, and he really nails kind of what's going on in this book. The novel was nominated for the Hugo Award, the Nebula Award, the World Fantasy Award, and a lot of others. The one that it won that was kind of a big deal was the Women's Prize for Fiction, which is a UK award that goes out. It's generally a fairly serious fiction award. It doesn't often skew speculative, but they're not afraid of it. Previous winners, I think either Circe or no, it was Song of Achilles, Madeline
Mhm,
Miller's one, as did The Power by Naomi Alderman. So they're not afraid to kind of read speculative, but it's often not. I think it's a little interesting that it won that among all the speculative awards it was nominated for and didn't win. But it was definitely on people's radar, and I think that's interesting for this book because this book feels like a sort of different level of literary novel than a lot of the sort of like award nominated and winning speculative fiction of the last couple years. Which I think
Yes.
we can talk about that. But it's also worth noting that Clarke, is herself was a beloved figure on the strength of Nolan Strange, which came out, I think, was it like 2005 or six, something like that, mid-aughts.
Gosh, yeah.
Yeah, and then had a long quiet period, and then we get this much much smaller. I meant to look up the percentage, like page wise, how Piranesi compares to Nolan Strange, 'cause it's much shorter.
Yeah, the version that I have is a 250 small pages, and Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is clocked in on Wikipedia, but as 782 pages.
Yeah, yep.
So,
And not like big text with big breaks between or anything. There's a lot going on in
no.
there.
Yeah.
So real quick, if you haven't read Piranesi, slightly hard book to summarize, but it's an epistolary novel. It's a journal of a man who is called Piranesi, although he's not sure that's his name. And he wanders a seemingly infinite labyrinth of a building that he just calls the house. It's these sort of endless halls of marble pillars with statues in every room. There are at least three floors. The basement is periodically flooded by an ocean. The upper levels are covered in cloud and send rain and fresh water. He lives on seaweed and fish and shellfish. And there's only one other living person that he occasionally encounters who he just refers to as the other. And the other is this man with snazzy suits and a nice beard who is trying to find some kind of mysterious power in the house, and he enlists Piranesi to help him find that. And that's kind of it. We'll get into more into where it goes, but it's a little bit of a mystery novel where we're trying to figure out what Piranesi doesn't know, and then Piranesi starts trying to figure out what's going on. And we talked about you and I, Misha, about this as a puzzle box kind of
hmm
book where it's not necessarily a mystery in the sense of like a whodunit, but you're trying to figure out what's going on with the larger structure. It has a lot of obvious sort of like Borges like kind of angles to it.
Yeah.
So I was wondering what was your first relationship with this book? If you remember what brought you to it the first time, or what your first sort of what your first reactions were?
Very clearly, actually, which is somewhat unusual for me. I don't always have the best memory, but I like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and then I was intrigued by like, oh, this author hasn't published anything else, and then 16 years later, this slight unrelated novel. I'll pick it up, sure, whatever. And when I started reading it, almost from the beginning, it felt to me like someone had transcribed some of my dreams,
Mm,
which is a very sort of woo-woo way to put it. But the way in which there is this beautiful description of the house, and yet it is something that makes no sense. It is um, something that the narrator is very clearly accepting of. He's not wondering like a lot of the questions that maybe the reader is wondering.
hmm
Where does, if he's always lived in the house, and the only things in the house are him and this one other live person and sort of fish and birds and statues. But he comments on the other's suit and the suit patterns and the cut. And it's like, okay, clearly he knows he has a knowledge base that is coming from outside this experience that he claims is his only experience. But like in a dream, he just sort of doesn't question that. That's just something he knows, and it's not very relevant right now. And he continues on in this very like peaceful way. And so I felt the water is a big theme in this book, and I almost felt like you just sort of sink into the pool of the novel and adjust to the way it's being told, which turns out to be delightful and delicious, but it takes a moment.
Yeah. I so this I read this for a book club in Chicago. And I was very hesitant because one, I am not a huge fan of kind of Regency set or Victorian fantasy, which was like my
Mhm.
impression of Norland Strange. I think Norland Strange is great, but so I was like, oh, I'm already a little hesitant. And then when I started reading, I was like, okay, I see what you're doing. You're doing a House of Leaves, Library of Babel kind of thing. Like I've read it before, not interested. And then it took about 2 pages for me to just be completely swept away by the narrative voice because it's just so good. The control of the epistolary and Piranesi as a character and just kind of his soul, the way it comes through, is just so fascinating.
Yes.
Um, and it frames these bigger issues and bigger thoughts without ignoring them and without drilling into them in like an irritating way where there's a lot in here going on about memory and the collective unconscious and maybe like platonic forms or something like that. But and it has, as we find out more about how Piranesi wound up here and what's going on, it has almost like a folk horror kind of backstory,
Yeah.
with this occult group that have kind of trapped him with these strange characters. But just, yeah, just totally blew me away in terms of Piranesi, the character's voice, and the imagery. And he has this kind of it is naive, but it's a kind of naivety that's almost like a strength.
Yes,
Um,
he's very kind.
hmm
And he, I think, suspects almost the entire time that the one other person he ever talks to is not a great person.
hmm
He's kind of mean and still goes forward in this, like, you're my friend. I will help you. I will try to avoid disappointing or angering you because I accept your flaws as just part of who you are. It's this uncommonly generous approach, especially for someone who really has nothing. He has
Yeah.
journals and like some bowls to catch water in.
hmm And the dream thing, I felt that too, reading this. This has just a quality, partially just in the writing, and partially it's not that unusual, I guess, to dream about houses and to dream
Hmm.
about architecture. And rereading it this time, I was thinking a lot about that and the way that I don't know if it's like this for you, but like I had a lot more vivid dreams when I was younger, and they're a lot more
Yeah,
rare now that I have really vivid dreams. And so many of them, I've had like recurring dreams that are, dream versions of houses or buildings I actually know.
right.
And thinking about the way that like when you're a child, so much of your experience is being in these structures that are not at your scale and you don't fully understand, and you're trying to navigate it along with everything else you're trying to navigate when you're a child, and how that seeps in. And that's very much what Piranesi feels like, where he is in this structure that, well, I don't know if it's human made in the traditional sense, but it's, it is a human building that is beyond human scale. And he thinks of
Yeah.
himself as the child of the house, right? That's how he thinks of it.
Yeah, it's really incredible too. You mentioned it, the mystery of this book, right? It's sort of a puzzle box, but very much shies away from, I think, the impulse to pick things apart until they're just sort of shreds left. We solve the main mystery, but a lot of things go unanswered. So by the end of the book, you know who this person is, how he got to the house, and sort of what the house might be. And it ends up taking the shape of more or less a portal fantasy,
Hmm.
where this person was once someone who lived in the UK and ended up coming to this sort of otherworldly place as a result of this occult ritual that he hadn't intended to take part in. And we learned that there are other supernatural worlds. That's it. We learn nothing about those.
Hmm.
There's no speculation about what they might look like. Piranesi expresses no desire to go to any of them. There is just sort of that's not the questions that we're answering here. There's not a lot of speculation as to like, well, why does this ritual work? And why are these particular statues here in this room? And how does the albatross that appears one time get it just is, and we want to know how he got here, but the rest is allowed to lie quietly for you to sort of ponder and for I think Piranesi to accept as just one of the things that the house has brought him.
Yeah, the relationship to Portal Fantasy is really fascinating because this, for me at least, is going to become like sort of a modern touchstone of when I'm explaining to someone what a Portal Fantasy is. Like this is something I'll talk about. But they are, and so a Portal Fantasy is a kind of, it's a fantasy technique where people go from our actual world into a secondary magical fantasy world. Like Narnia is like the touchstone. And they're often either just a technique that like I just need to get someone someplace cool, and this is the way I thought I have to do it. Or I should say, and or they're often strongly allegorical. And
Yeah, Alice in Wonderland is maybe another
yeah,
example.
uh-huh, yep. And this is, boy, I don't want to say it's not allegorical, but it's much harder to put your finger on what's going on with it. Yeah, I don't know. It left me thinking a lot about what what this is saying about our current world from the perspective that like Portal Fantasies usually kind of say something about that because
Yeah.
it's not escapist per se. I think it is interesting the way that the house becomes a place that Piranesi, even after he learns his situation and gets out, wants to go back to,
Hmm.
slash thinks he's always in some larger way. I want to talk more about the ending of this book because I just really, really, really adore the ending of this book. But we also meet what's his name? Is it John Ritter? James Ritter?
James Ritter.
Yeah,
Hmm.
poor James Ritter, who was another person who was against his will brought to this world and became kind of addicted to it. And yeah, just it sits very uneasily next to something like Narnia, which is like this sort of magical place that has some unpleasant parts, but is mostly like full of very pleasant imagery and pleasant things. And Jesus, much less clear what's going on here.
Yeah, and there's always this sort of in I won't say always. There's usually in Portal fantasies the struggle of like, well, you've had a lovely time here, or you've had an impactful time or adventurous time, but you do have to go back to where you belong. And that is technically the shape of Piranesi. He came from our world. He eventually returns to our world. But because we start the book in the secondary world already, he's already gone through the portal and has in fact forgotten that he ever went through a portal. It feels different. And he goes to go live in the UK and he meets all of, his family members and friends and so on that wondered where he was all this time. And he doesn't really remember them and he doesn't really consider himself the same person anymore, not just in a sense of like, oh, I've changed, but in a sense of this person's gone. The
Hmm.
person who you miss is simply gone. And that's not quite the normal vibe of a Portal fantasy. And there's also the idea that Piranesi can always go back.
Hmm.
He visits, he takes James Ritter back occasionally to visit, but refuses to leave him there because James Ritter can't support himself, he can't feed himself, and navigates the modern world with this sort of half consciousness, the understanding of the world that he got from being born there,
Hmm.
but the perspective that he got from spending so much formative time in the house.
Yeah, the identity thing is really interesting where, if we're to believe the narrator, there's really three characters that we're following right by
Hmm.
the end. That we have Piranesi, which is what he's called by the other person, who thinks of himself as the child of the house, um, who writes the bulk of the book. And then we get some journals from Matthew Rose Sorensen, who is who he was before he came in.
Hmm.
And Matthew Sorensen is the one who's been mostly wiped away from his mind. But Piranesi says, like, Matthew, what does he say? That, tell my family that he's here, he's inside me, I'm taking care of him, like he's
Yeah,
sleeping, which is interesting, psychologically, but it's also the way that he talks about the literal dead. He,
yeah,
he takes care of the bones of people that he's found in the house, and it's the same way he talks about them. And then we're told at the end by the narrator that this is a third person, that I'm neither Piranesi nor Matthew Rose Sorensen. I'm something else. Yeah, it's really fascinating. And the book doesn't have any, expository info dumping, as you know, Bob, here's how memory
mhm,
works. But I was thinking a lot about the way that so much of this is about the way that this character, Matthew Rose Sorensen's memory has been stripped away because one of the features of the house is just how it leaches away your memory, and how he has adapted in this very strange way and turned into someone else. I was thinking a lot about, do you know the film Memento,
mhm.
where that's a film about someone with short-term memory loss, and it's like a neo-noir, who has been taking lots of notes for himself in order to function, but has also started, unknown to his current self, he's been erasing or throwing away some of them in order to function, in order to sort of like inject ambiguity into his life to like give him room to do things that he wouldn't be able to do otherwise. And the way that's sort of what's happened to Piranesi, that he's had to forget everything about his old self in order to be able to function in the house, and
Yeah.
and how that lines up very strangely when he eventually comes out.
I almost see it as one of the proposals of the book is that there are certain kinds of people who can exist in certain places. So Matthew Rose Sorensen, when we see him in the sort of journal entries briefly before he gets to the house, he seems like not a terrible person, but not particularly pleasant. There's a he makes a note, and it's his journal, so he's aware of this, but he makes a note that he's always been rather fond of being right. And that person, I think, can't exist in the house.
Hmm.
And the person who is Piranesi comes to be as a type of person who can exist in a house.
Hmm.
And then when Piranesi leaves, Piranesi also has to change and become this third narrator because this sort of simplicity is a fraught word, but he has a sort of simple acceptance and joy and care and obligation to other people that frankly, like contemporary London is not equipped. You can't survive with that kind of attitude. And so he becomes someone else again. But I wonder if part of the point of the book almost is in this space that the house represents, that if you let yourself, and the other never does, he leaves before he is affected by the place. But if you let yourself, you could become happy with the world.
Hmm.
You could become satisfied with the things that are offered to you and interested in the places around you and not sort of hurrying and torn with worry and anxiety and disliking other people and feeling grief and all of these things that are very hard about the experience of being human in this world.
Yeah, there's that almost like it's very naive, but it's also almost utopian when the third person, when Piranesi in the outside is talking about like problem with money.
Hmm.
And it's being, and like I can't remember the exact quote, but he's basically like, this just seems like such a bad system. Like, how about I have a thing you need, I can give it you when you need it, and when you have
Hmm.
something I need, I can you can give it to me.
The
Um,
idea that people would just want to take stuff to have more stuff
mhm.
is completely alien to him.
And that is fascinating because that's not that's not a part of Matthew Rose Sorensen so far as we know, right?
No.
This seems to be something that has emerged in this sort of like wiped clean and started over person who is Piranesi. And
Yeah.
it doesn't seem as though it's happened to anyone else in the house.
I think so. It's hard to say, of course. Like, I think Susanna Clarke doesn't want to hit us over the head with a, like, this is the meaning of the book. But we find out that at least one of the theories about how the house came to be is that in the ancient days, humans talked to objects, to the things in their environment, and those things talked back. And there was a sort of communion between animal and object and material and spirit. And as the ancients chose to, I think, leave that form of spiritual practice, the animation in the world ended up going away. And it sort of leaked into these other worlds. And so I think where Piranesi finds himself in this house is a world in which there is, for lack of a better way to say it, there is a loving God. There is something that cares about you. The house takes care of you, and the house likes you, or doesn't. I mean, possibly, but at least for Piranesi, he calls himself the child of the house. I think not in a sort of saccharine way, but in a
Hmm.
very much like I have a relationship with the place that I live, and it has a relationship to me.
Yeah, no, I think you are totally right. And that's something I haven't seen discussed a ton with this. A burr under my saddle in speculative fiction is how little religion is engaged with on like a serious level.
Yeah.
There's lots of fantasy books that have kind of like stock, quote unquote, gods or deities of different kinds, but there's very little that engages with how religion actually shapes our society in a way that's still like very, very potent, very obvious to see, I think, in the US right now, or that engages with the sort of like deeper questions of spirituality that ideally are part of religion as well. It's very rare that I read fantasy that feels like it's really thinking about faith or about like relation to larger things in the way this book does without ever naming God. There's no capital G God in here, although there are lots of capital letters in here.
Yes.
But yeah, that attitude of openness to the world and sort of believing both that there is like inherent life and value in the world. So Piranesi thinks about the very few people he meets until the end of the book. He thinks about the bodies of the dead. He thinks about the statues. He thinks about the birds, all in
Hmm.
this way of sort of respecting that there's some sort of identity and personhood there with this kind of openness and curiosity and generosity, and thinks that he himself is being taken care of by the house in this way that's really fascinating. And without ever saying this is about one particular religion, is just this interesting window on cultivating this attitude of mindfulness and thankfulness, and showing us this really enchanting character who has successfully done that. And I think it's interesting, like particularly as an epistolary novel, and I want to circle back to how well that's done because I think it's interesting stylistically. It's done so well stylistically that I think it leaves open for you as the reader to remember that, oh, this is just what Piranesi is writing down. So you can imagine how Piranesi looks like to other people. And there are a couple of these little moments where you can see that particularly where, you realize, oh, he has super long unkempt hair that he's put like fish bones and bits of foil wrapper in and things like that. And, when he comes out, he has what sounds like a very severe mental disturbance, and we know that other people who've gone in the house have displayed similar things. So it gives you this way of potentially reading this as like this is someone with, some sort of severe disconnect from reality, who should maybe be hospitalized. But of course, you've read the journals and you have this totally other way of looking at it that feels very genuine.
And I also think that it's being like, oh, this was all in his head is one step removed from ending a book by saying, and it was all a dream.
Right.
You're refusing to sort of interact with the story in a genuine way. But part of that being treated as if he's had some sort of break with consensus reality
Hmm.
is, I think, part of showing this person can't exist in this place being the contemporary world, because his version of reality is incommensurate with this version of reality. They cannot be together.
Yeah, and that trying to think how to say this. Just that putting those two side by side, but then still giving you a way to believe Piranesi, right? Because I mean, that you don't seriously doubt that he's having a mental episode this whole time, right? Like we've seen the
No,
house. Yeah, we know that's what really happened. It just gives this very odd, and I don't want to use the word utopian, but it gives this vision of someone able to cultivate a mindset that is so alien to capitalist realism and this idea that everything has to fit into these restrictive systems outside the house and that he can carry that out. It's just, yeah, it's really interesting, really fascinating.
I kind
Um,
of see it as a refutation of the state of nature that you see in a lot of
mhm, mhm,
Enlightenment philosophies. And if you go and read Rousseau, his version of the state of nature is like humans hate each other so much that they consciously avoid each other, and if they happen to meet, then best case scenario, they have sex. Worst case scenario, they kill each other violently.
mhm,
Um, and this is just how humans naturally are. And I feel like the house is a proposition of like maybe the state of nature for humans, if they were actually relatively well provided for, is one of curiosity. Piranesi thinks of himself as a scientist
mhm,
and makes these really detailed tables of the tides in the different rooms. So curiosity, kindness, interest in other people, and a sort of sympathy or empathy, I guess, to everything around him, where his reverence for the dead is not very similar to our reverence for the dead. He's not really thinking about like, well, this was once a person, so he's like, this is a person. They happen to be dead, but when there's a big flood, for instance, he moves them so they won't
mhm,
get swept away. And he also explains, like, hey, there's a lot of water right now. Don't worry, it's going to go away. I know it's sort of freaky right now, but it's okay. And that actually doesn't make any sense
mhm,
unless you believe this object also has a personhood in the here and now.
mhm. There's that moment when the detective who comes in looking for him and Piranesi is talking about the dead, and it takes a while for the detective to realize that these are dead people he's talking about. But Piranesi says, I take them offerings of food and flowers and talk to them. Don't you do
Hmm.
this for your dead? And there's this sort of awkward silence. And it's not that, I think it's not that Piranesi has said something weird so much as that it's highlighted that, oh yeah, we typically don't have that kind of reverent relationship with our dead. And maybe we should. That's the
Hmm.
way it struck me anyway. And
Or at
yeah, that,
least not in sort of white Western
yeah,
culture.
right. Yeah, right. That there's this often this disconnect from it. Yeah. I want to talk about the epistolary form here
Yeah.
because that is part of why this book is so incredibly excellent. And I'm trying to put my finger on what about this works so much better than a lot that I read in terms of the epistolary. And I mean, there is just this control of the voice that's very, very good and like
Hmm.
very quickly establishing kind of this is how this character talks and thinks and writes. It's also in the world, this is a character who, before they went into the house, were kind of anachronistic in keeping handwritten journals and handwritten notes, which is why they were selected by their abductors to go to the house because they knew that they needed someone to go there and take notes. But I was just thinking about the way that often when I read, uh, particularly fantasy and science fiction, that has a first person narration that is couched in some kind of, this is my journal or this is a letter or something like that, it's often not very believable to me.
Yeah.
And hopefully like the weird elements kind of like take me away from that and kind of forget about it. But they're rarely written as though someone were actually writing it down at some point in their day, like in a physical diary or in a letter and sending it somewhere. And I was thinking about the way that, the novel was, this is maybe unfair, but the novel as a form was kind of birthed as epistolaries, right? That was the first way that people started trying to sell these stories, was sort of reaching out to existing forms of writing that people were doing a lot of. And I was just thinking about the way that there's so much less long form writing now, like at individual non-artistic level. Like I feel like people, it's a lot less common to write super long letters to people. We have, email and text messages and various kinds of things that allow us to be like much quicker, be to write in brief and not do sort of our own narratives so much. And wondering if maybe that's kind of part of why this is way too big a claim, but like part of why literature has kind of ceded ground to other media. Like there's lots of other reasons, but that if you don't have experience of sort of quote unquote normal narrative correspondence or narrative journaling from yourself, from people that the sort of unreality of that in a fictional setting doesn't strike you as much.
I
Um,
mean, I think there's definitely an issue of duration and attention span and how long things are supposed to take.
mhm.
Um, but in order to avoid picking apart the entirety of contemporary
Yeah.
society, I think we only have two novels. No, we have two novels and a book of short stories by
Mhm.
Susanna Clarke. And in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, she's clearly interested in a historical mode of narration. I think one of the reasons why that book is so good is because it is set in a sort of Regency-ish. I can't remember what year it is actually set in. It spans a couple of years, but she nails the narrative style.
Mm.
Um, and that is so important for it not being twee, it not being annoying. Um,
Mm.
it is very, very close to Jane Austen in the kind of slightly dry, slightly wry. There's a slight distance between the characters and the narrator, but most of the time it sort of fades away.
Mhm.
And then I think in Piranesi, she's doing it very good. Again, a spot on version of a different kind of writing, which honestly reminds me most of like, I want to say Augustine's Confessions. It's not
Oh, yeah.
quite it, but this sort of writing to oneself, not just as a record of the day, but as a way of thinking
Mhm.
through the understanding of the world and is externalizing your sort of scientific curiosity about the world when we did not have like a bunch of data points in a computer, when your own observations in your notebook were crucial data. Not that they aren't still, but
Right. Yeah, it has like not a specific historical time period kind of feel to it in terms of like antiquities, in the language or something, but the mode of I am not an armchair scientist, but a sort of a naturalist, a capital N naturalist in this sort of like,
yeah,
Royal Society of Fellows kind of way. And
he's a natural philosopher.
yeah, it reminded me a lot of like, without being able to put like my finger on which one in particular, it reminded me a lot of like 18th, maybe even 17th century philosophy that I've read, or letters, maybe like I went through a big period where I was reading a lot of Keats letters,
Mhm.
and yeah, just this have partially it's the capitals, and this
Yes.
in this way that I'm saying it like it's kind of funny, but it's also dead serious that it's a way of showing that in Piranesi's mind, he has elevated a lot more objects into like objects of significance.
Right.
Um, you know, the halls, the tides, the albatross, I think is capitalized, right? Like,
It's not,
oh, it's not. Oh, interesting.
which I think is really interesting. And the birds are generally not.
Hmm.
Um, I think because they come and go.
Yeah.
And so we have like the halls, the house, the statues, the other, these are things that are recurring features
Hmm.
in his life. But like he doesn't capitalize seaweed, for instance, even though
Right,
that
right.
is
Very
very
important.
important.
Yeah.
But there's something sacred about capitalizing certain things to be like it's hard to put into words because we have like sort of the way in which he calls this other person the other because there's
Hmm.
only one other. There's also only one house.
Hmm.
And so it is the house with capital. Whereas there might be like a bunch of crows or a bunch of seaweed or a bunch of whatever.
Yeah.
Um, and we have sort of largely, I think, decided as a society that you're not allowed to capitalize things randomly in formal language to show their significance.
Hmm.
Um, Although, of course, online language and text language, people get around those and use different orthographies in order to show emphasis.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that is what is going on here. And just it gives that this air of kind of simplicity, kind of like childlike feeling of like
Hmm.
what I have decided is important here. But it just works so well. I know we both just read Sophia Samatar's The Practice, the Horizon, and the Chain, which
Hmm.
is not an epistolary novel, but it does a similar thing, right? Where like in a very short book, when a few things are capitalized and a few things are not, sort of unusually, it really draws your attention to them and just sort
Yeah.
of imbues it that way. One of the things that gets me a lot about epistolary novels is, or not just the epistolary format, I guess, in popular novels, which, it can be letters, it can be journals, is how often it's sort of used as a framing device and then kind of forgotten about, right? And
Yeah.
I think part of the reason that this works so well is that there are these little reminders throughout that, oh, he's actually writing this down at a
Right.
certain point of the day, and he's actually recollecting what has happened a little bit earlier. So even though he is a good writer, and that's one of those things that always kind of stretches disbelief, I think, in an epistolary novel is that what we're actually reading is something that has been crafted and edited with great skill. And then you have to suspend your disbelief that, wait a second, someone just wrote this down, like, like on their first draft in their little diary, like this well, right? That's just something you have to kind of forget about when you're reading that.
Even then, though, Matthew Rose Sorensen is a journalist, right?
Right.
So, and an academic, and he's written papers and stuff. So, like,
Yeah.
I think, like, even then, she sprinkles in, like, he was a well-written person.
Right. Yeah. Right. That's a good point. That's a really good point. There's this point from Matthew Rose Sorensen's journal that, so when Piranesi finally like recovers and finds in the journals that he does have the things he has forgotten. And Sorensen is recounting his abduction, basically. And he says, this is a parenthetical comment. He says, writing this, I feel a sort of terror descend on me. I know now what is coming. My hand is shaking, and I must stop writing for a moment to try to control it. But at the time, I felt nothing, no presentiment of danger, nothing. And just
Yeah.
this little reminder that like this actually is a journal that someone is writing later. And having those little bits, I just really dig, and it gives this, I don't know, sense of solidity and to the voice that this is actually how, when Piranesi has a moment at the end of the day to recollect himself and to write, this is what his voice sounds like.
And the delightful, like, reference, I think, to you mentioned at the beginning of the our conversation that there's a sort of folk horror element
Hmm.
to this, like, charismatic, deranged leader of a small occult group that
Hmm.
discovers a way between worlds. Um, and both that and the way that Matthew Rose Sorensen writes about it with a sort of like recollecting it now, I quake in fear. It's very early horror fiction. It's sort of
Aha.
very Poe short
Yes.
stories, Lovecraft short stories in a delightful way, especially because unlike Lovecraft, who's like, and then I turned into the worst thing, someone who wasn't English. Um,
Right.
Piranesi effectively becomes someone who isn't English, and
Hmm.
it's great. It's
Hmm.
great. He
Oh,
loves it.
interesting. Yeah. That is really interesting. The transition from like, when you think about portal fantasies, where the fantasy is often like, I went and I became the king and hero of this whole magical land where they have delicious foods and they gave me a castle and a cool sword, the
Yeah.
very, very classic wish fulfillment stuff. And it's both really fascinating and kind of depressing. But like for a working journalist, the dream fantasy is just becoming someone who's essentially happy. Right?
I
Like,
yeah.
right? Doesn't worry about where the food's coming from because it's coming from the house. I'll just catch some fish. It'll be great.
It's true, but I don't even know if that is consciously Sorensen's fantasy, right?
Right, right, yeah.
But it is what he needed
hmm
nonetheless.
Yeah. And this idea that the house maybe gives you what you need, but that's something that Piranesi doesn't, how to say this. We don't know where Piranesi has gotten his theory about the house, which is pretty well
Hmm.
developed, and nobody else has it, right? And there are these occult figures who have been studying it and trying to use it and like kind of have misunderstood how it all works. But none of them have the theory that it's this like wellspring of generosity. Uh,
Right.
but Piranesi does. And, we're led to believe that he's right, but he's just sort of deduced this. I don't know.
I think it's part of the him having a relationship to the house having a relationship back to him. He has developed this theory because he has opened his sort of mind and heart to hearing what the house has to say back to him. And it doesn't say through words, it says through his lived experience
Mm,
of always being safe and being provided for in this incredibly dangerous environment where he very easily could have fallen off a statue and died, or starved to death, or huge variety of things,
mm.
and he doesn't. And that's actually when he, at the end of the book, when he comes out into our world and people ask him where he's been, he says, I was in a house with a lot of water. Sometimes the waves washed over me, but always I was saved. And the always I was saved is repeated several times, and I think really speaks to his deep belief that the house is actively taking care of him.
Yeah. All right. That's a good point. Let's take a quick break. All right, we are back. We are still talking about Piranesi. We are going ever deeper into the house. One thing we didn't mention, and I feel like everyone who's talked about this book, uh, you have to talk about Narnia and you have to talk about House of Leaves. And two of the first statues that we see are the faun, right?
Yeah,
And the minotaurs.
yeah.
Which the fawn is like, I feel like no, the fawn in the lamppost, that's like no question. That's a Narnia thing right there. The Minotaurs, I feel like maybe a little bit more of a stretch. I don't know that that necessarily indicates it has something to do with House of Leaves, but
It just feels more like a labyrinth, overall
yeah,
labyrinth
right.
thing.
But I want to think it's reaching towards that. But of course, House of Leaves has an extremely different vibe than this book. But are you familiar with House of Leaves?
I
Have you
have read House of Leaves,
Yeah.
and it's interesting because I think it is a this is gonna be extremely controversial opinion. I think it is almost a good book.
Ah, nice. No, I like that. I like that. I dig that. Uh-huh.
Because I think that the thing that is fun and interesting in House of Leaves is the part about the house.
Right.
And then there's this whole other thing about a guy who kind of sucks, frankly,
hmm
um, learning about the house, learning about the video, and then going on a journey of madness. And I don't care about his journey of madness. I only care about the house.
I'm gonna do a completely normie House of Leaves lover take, and say that actually, yeah, it's the framing that is what makes it work. I think holding out the lure of here's this interesting thing, this actually interesting story about this
Mhm.
house and this video that this guy made, and then sort of not giving it to you and giving it you in little tiny bits and pieces interspersed with all this, textual experimentation and layers of footnotes and deceptions, I think is what is cool about it. But I think there is something to that about it being almost great.
We could have a
Um,
different podcast where it's
yeah,
a fight to the death
right.
over
No, I
whether it's
think
good.
no, that's a good take. I like that. I remember reading a critical review of an early Modest Mouse album
Hmm.
that said that how did they say exactly? Basically, like they said a good band would have cut 7 of these tracks.
Hmm.
And it's up to the listener to decide if that makes them a great band for including them or a subpar band for including them. I think there's a similar thing there. You know, the Library of Babel or Babel is one that
Hmm.
comes up a lot as well, reading and thinking about this book. And it strikes me that in a way, this book is almost the opposite of that because
Yeah.
the Library of Babel is sort of a mental experiment in infinity and sort of randomness. And it is kind of fascinating that, yeah, if you had a book of a certain length with a certain number of characters and you just had infinite variations of that, that somewhere out there is every book that could be written. And the
Hmm.
problem would be finding it. And that is kind of fascinating and weird. But this book is fundamentally not about randomness, right? Like the house, we don't fully understand it. Piranesi doesn't fully understand it, but the idea is that it is a almost like a distillation or maybe like crystallization of meaning in a way that's
Yeah.
like very much the opposite of that.
One of the hypotheses that we get about what the house is um, comes from the Lawrence Arn Sales is
Oh
his
yeah,
name.
uh-huh.
The kind of person who has in the real world, so to speak, instigated the search for this place. And he believes that it is a sort of repository for forgotten ideas or
Mhm.
old ideas from the sort of collective unconsciousness of humanity, that like a fawn is there because at some point fawns were really important
Mhm.
to the minds of people, and now they're not. And so it's sort of gone to live in the house as a statue. But I find that somewhat unlikely, partially because Arn Sales is depicted as someone who is very impressed with himself.
Mhm.
And I'm not inclined to like believe wholeheartedly the things that he says.
Mhm.
And I think Piranesi isn't either. But also because the statues that are described, for instance, there's statues that are two children like laughing and playing. I think they have flowers. That we haven't
Or flutes,
forgotten
I
the
think. Yeah.
oh,
Uh-huh.
flutes. Sorry, yes,
Yeah.
we haven't forgotten the concept of like happy children.
Hmm.
Um,
Right.
that
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
not something that is like, sort of detritus of history. And Piranesi, well, I guess the third narrator, who is neither Matthew Rose Sorensen or Piranesi, at the like last scene in the book, claims that he's walking around and he sees a mother and two kids, and he says, "I recognize them. These two kids were it is the faces of the kids who are the statues with the flute, and the woman is herself a different statue." And so there is some sort of ongoing conversation between these two worlds. And I'm more inclined to think that, similar to how both of us sort of experienced it as a dreamlike space when we first picked up the book, that there is something about the ongoing unconsciousness and dreaming of humanity that continues to shape the house and continues to sort of, I think, tell narratives that are meaningful and affecting without
Hmm.
the need for words. Because the Library of Babel, right, you need to be able to read all the books in there.
Hmm. Right.
The statues, you just need to be able to either see or feel them.
Hmm. And it's I love that it's reaching for this theory that it's not quite totally verbalizing about how thought and memory work and
Yeah.
reality. And I feel like there's not a ton of science fiction or fantasy that like really grapple with that kind of, you could call it platonic,
Hmm.
or maybe like Jungian kind of thing. But the ones that do really jump out at me, and this is the most evocative that I've read in a while. I was thinking there's a much more I don't want to say attenuated, but it's a very small part of it. But this is part of Neil Stephenson's Anathem,
Hmm.
which is like a multiverse science fiction novel where different earlier versions of the universe are sort of flowing into later versions with all kinds of like effects on both math and on, people and how things look. And yeah, I just love that idea in here that Piranesi has clued into this idea that the statues are, I don't know, kind of like capital V virtues, or they're sort of like ideal potential forms of things. Um,
Yeah, because there are statues that are less happy.
hmm
There's ones that involve struggle
hmm
or pain, but they still seem very archetypal in that sort
hmm
of Jungian dreamscape way. Um, and I think we are starting to see more people in science fiction and fantasy grappling with the idea of like, well, if is there something outside of the material
hmm
that isn't like, Christian heaven and hell or
right.
um because Exordia also does this, to
hmm
go back to the first book I mentioned,
Yeah.
actually, where it posits that some of this alien technology runs on the moral reality
hmm
of space, which is, I mean, the whole book is getting into the stakes of that. If in Exordia there's a moral plane of reality, I feel like the house takes place in this like concepts plane of reality,
Yeah.
archetypes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Conceptual. Yeah. That's interesting that more things are maybe doing that. That gives me a little bit of hope because going back to the idea of third man Piranesi, Piranesi on the outside being this sort of like glimmer of sort of utopian or anarchic resistance.
Yeah.
That, so much science fiction and fantasy right now of like sort of more traditional forms than this book, are about resisting empire and about
Hmm.
trying to think of ways to avert or survive climate change and, trying to think of ways to like fight or escape the system that we're in now. But they often leave me with a little bit of like head scratching, like, what is this the way? Is this useful? Like, it's nice as an escape, but maybe a totally different framing of the question is more what's needed. Um,
There's a lot of stories I think right now that are essentially end up being trying to use the master's tools to disassemble the master's
yeah,
house,
right.
and they don't work
Uh-huh.
entirely.
Yeah.
I think for obvious reasons.
hmm Yeah, no, I mean it's super tricky, especially when the forms of, again, and we're not talking about Piranesi, but more traditional fantasy and science fiction, where, the quest narrative, the you must vanquish an enemy narrative, those are just not structured to really speaking to the problem that we're in right now. I was thinking about, to go back to another book we talked about, Sofia Samatar's last novella, where, that is about people who are, actually imprisoned, actually chained, as well as people who are effectively, socially chained, controlled.
Hmm.
And that the ending of that is so much about you don't want to become the next guards, right? You don't want to just
Yeah.
become, I don't want to win the lottery and just become the next billionaire asshole who is, perpetuating this horrible system. You've got to find another way out.
Right.
Yeah. Uh, Piranesi gets out, sort of, kind of. So the end of this book, I don't have any theory about it. I just love the vibe of it so much. The book as a whole has a often, I would call it sort of enchanting vibe. Piranesi is a kind of naive but very thoughtful, and very not flighty, but he gets excited about things, right? And he wants
Hmm.
to share things with his journal, which, is sort of with a you, that is us, the reader, and he wants to share things with the other people he encounters. And there are moments of danger, and when he starts realizing what's happened, he has like this sort of prolonged violent fantasy that he feels guilty about. But most of the book is like fairly just sort of, yeah, happy, and whimsical is the wrong word, but it just has this really transporting magical quality. And then the end of it has this strange, somber but not sad feeling of
Yeah.
thinking about the way that, yeah, because he sees those children, he sees an old man in the park, that he says, I saw you in the house, and you were a king, you were a good king in another place. And then just has this description of just the setting. I'm just going to read this last little bit. He says, I came out of the park. The city streets rose up around me. There was a hotel with a courtyard with metal tables and chairs for people to sit in more clement weather. Today they were snow-strewn and forlorn. A lattice of wire was strung across the courtyard. Paper lanterns were hanging from the wires, spheres of vivid orange that blew and trembled in the snow and the thin wind. The sea-gray clouds raced across the sky, and the orange lanterns shivered against them. The beauty of the house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite. So it has this quality of he is he's aware of his aloneness and his loneliness in a way that he wasn't in the house, because now he's out among all these people and sort of realizing that he needs to fit in the ways that he doesn't fit in. And it has this, this sort of, kind of quiet, kind of chilly, kind of maybe slightly depressing kind of scene setting, but that he is looking at the world he is out in, not as though he's outside the house, but as though it's sort of a separate part of the house.
Yeah.
Um, and it's really fascinating. It reminded me of two specific sequences in two other books that I think about a lot. One of them, this listener surprise, this episode is actually about Sophia Samatar, as every episode will be. But in A Stranger in Alondria, which is Samatar's first novel, which is a sort of unusual fantasy novel about this man who is haunted by a ghost slash angel. At the end of the book, after he has kind of been exorcised and the ghost is no longer with him, it has this really intense, almost fourth wall breaking part. It says the silence, end of all poetry, all romances, where he's talking about closing a book and the feeling of like being in a world and then coming away from it and sort of coming back to yourself and sort of like noticing your surroundings again after you've been somewhere else. And it's sort of, I don't want to say magical, but it's really rich in terms of its description of the world and sort of like re-immersing yourself after you've been gone. But it's also an expression of grief, right? That now
Yeah.
I'm not part of this fantastic world anymore. And the other thing that this made me think of it the first time I read it, and I went back and reread it just before we did this, is oddly enough, The Island of Dr. Moreau,
Hmm.
which which is about a guy on an island full of animal abominations. Also features an old weirdo, which I think we could compare Lawrence Sales to, right?
Right.
Old English scientific perverts are like a vital force for good science fiction and fantasy. But there's this point. So at the very end, it's after the narrator has escaped the island and gotten back to society, and it just has this like paragraph or two where he relates that. I mean, today we would probably call it, post-traumatic stress disorder. But he is unable to be around people because he thinks they might be animal people.
Hmm.
And I have the line here. Yeah, it says, "Then I look about me at my fellow men and I go in fear. I see faces, keen and bright, others dull or dangerous, others unsteady, insincere, none that have the calm authority of a reasonable soul. I feel as though the animal was surging up through them, that presently the degradation of the islanders will be played over again on a larger scale. I know this is an illusion, that these seeming men and women about me are indeed men and women forever, perfectly reasonable creatures, full of human desires and tender solicitude, emancipated from instinct and the slaves of no fantastic law. Yet I shrink from them, from their curious glances, their inquiries and assistance, and long to be away from them and alone." And that's kind of like where he's left at the end. And he's kind of like he's getting better, he's working on it, but that has like this dark side, right? You can imagine Piranesi just deciding like, there's too many people, this is too strange, I have to go back. And he hasn't done that so far as we know.
Yeah. I think there's this like in a lot of portal fantasy again, which I guess Island of Dr. Moreau isn't exactly a portal fantasy, but he goes to a strange
Yeah.
place and then he
Hmm.
returns. Um, the return is traumatic because the experiences that the person has had no longer match up with the experiences of the people around them, and they find themselves a stranger in what was once a home. And I almost feel like the ending of Piranesi is an invitation or a subtle sort of refusal of that, where Piranesi the third, whoever this third person is,
Hmm.
um, looks at a very, very ordinary street scene, the kind that perhaps the reader might encounter
Hmm.
after they close the book and they go outside,
Hmm.
um, and doesn't experience himself as separated from this place that gave him so much. He brings it back he folds both of these places together, and says, like, no, I have not been exiled from the house. The house is here. It looks different. I feel different about it, maybe, but the house is still here. And I think that this makes sense given he leaves, and he leaves because he wants to meet other humans,
Hmm.
basically. Um, and the person that he leaves with is Raphael, this police officer who she seems very nice, she's very capable, and her colleagues sort of reference her being a bit of an oddball and a loner.
Hmm.
They kind of lightly tease her in a way that Piranesi doesn't really understand. Um, but that there's this idea that people who are alone, who feel alone, don't have to be truly alone. Like the
Hmm.
house is with you wherever you go, even on a sort of depressing, snowy street. And every time I get to that final line, I practically cry because there's something so, I think, somber and a little sad, but also gentle and
Hmm.
generous
Hmm.
about being able to say, this is the beauty of the house is here. And it is an act of kindness from the house that I am witnessing this right now.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like we talked to you at the beginning about satire and how we're in this weird moment where it's not clear, like, what's up or down with irony and sincerity kind of in the
Hmm.
culture at large. But I think that this book earns this really sincere, simple statement at the end,
Yeah.
that's just so potent because it just means it and it's hard to read it. Yeah, it's
I
wonderful.
think that um I mean, that's sort of, you were mentioning Piranesi as like naive, and I almost think that's not quite. I think the book wants us to realize that's not quite it.
Hmm.
Because he does come off as incredibly naive because he's not cynical, essentially.
Right.
Um, but I think that one of the virtues of the epistolary format is that we can see he's not so much naive as just extremely honest.
Hmm.
If he doesn't understand what's going on, he says so.
Yeah.
If he hopes that someone will be his friend, he says so.
Hmm.
Um, and in his journals, he is 100% straightforward about, like, this made me angry, and I had a sort of intense fantasy of, even his violent fantasy is basically like the guy dies through like negligence,
Right.
and he
Yeah.
doesn't really do that much to hurt him. But and I think basically he goes into our world, and the his knowledge base expands, so he's no longer seems quite as naive,
Hmm.
but that clarity of vision remains.
Hmm. Yeah. Going back to that idea of this sort of in opposition to like a Rousseau or a Hobbes kind of state of nature. Yeah, it's not naivete so much as the I don't want to call it evil, but the apparatus of modern life that allows us to ignore things and to overlook things and to act in selfish ways is part of what's been stripped away from him, right?
Yeah,
That it's almost like a veil of ignorance, just to bring Rawls in, and we can argue about
yeah,
Rawls. But this idea that like if you could take away all the specifics that make people selfish or bigoted or misguided, take away all the specifics and just sort of leave their curiosity, leave their rationality, that you'd actually be left with someone pretty good.
yeah.
And that's what's happened here.
You could also connect it to essentially Piranesi has not eaten from the apple of the tree of knowledge.
Right.
He
Yeah.
doesn't know a lot of stuff, but he's better off for not knowing that
Hmm.
stuff.
I love that from a crafts perspective, going back to the detective that because this book is just so brilliantly formed and like the metaphor is too easy, but compared to Jonathan, I always screw that. Compared to Neural and Strange, um, it just feels like chiseled out of marble, right? Like it just feels
Yeah.
like this was just honed till it's just perfect. Not that Neural and Strange is like a sloppy book, but it's just like this is so much smaller and like every word just sort of drops perfectly and you pay attention to it. But it's interesting to think that there's also this sort of like occult folk horror angle that you could have written this book from that, and right, we get a glimpse of them, right? There's like a whole
Yeah.
cast of characters with betrayals and loves and complicated stories. And then we get Raphael, who's like this Twin Peaksy true detective-y, like twigs to the occult police person, right, who's able to
Yeah.
come in, yeah, and it's just
And who
but
never gives up until
ne
she finds the person.
yeah. And I mean, I do want to be clear that ACAB, but really fascinating character. And I just love that, like many other writers would have given us chapters, right, from Raphael's perspective, or
Hmm.
maybe framed the whole book in terms of this person, trying to crack this bizarre case of supernatural disappearances. But just I don't know, Clarke's control in building up everything that needs for this story to work, and then just keeping it to this one voice.
Yeah.
And it works so well. Yeah.
I don't think that is probably something she was actively thinking about, but in terms of like we see Piranesi as maybe a version of like the good parts of what it means to be human.
Hmm.
I also think Raphael kind of represents like if you could have
Yeah, right. What if good
a
cops
good
exist?
cop.
Yeah.
That's that.
Right.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
sort of hesitate to say it in that
Yeah.
symbol, but like
Yeah.
she is very kind. She goes after someone, this just like random guy who is not that important,
Hmm.
who disappears, and when she receives information that like leads her to believe that maybe he disappeared into another dimension, she's like,
Hmm.
okay, I will find the other dimension instead of just going, it is. Now he probably went to France or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
Um, she is very open to understanding. And when she talks to Piranesi in the house, she is very careful to not contradict his viewpoint of
Hmm.
the world.
Yeah.
And when when he's like, "Oh, there's 16 people here," and she's like, "What? There are?" And he's like, "Oh, it's okay. Most of them are dead." She doesn't yell at him or
Hmm.
anything. She just sort of goes, "Oh, okay. Like I see. That's how we talk about things here."
Hmm.
And it is, I think, the echo of Piranesi's like curiosity and open-mindedness and honesty is found in someone who, I mean, is ironically a cop, but
Hmm.
has does seem to sort of not quite find her place in society because
Yeah.
she is willing to listen.
Hmm. So one of the qualities that I really prize in writing, and it's super hard to do, is getting across the feeling that relatively minor characters have lives of their own, and in that
Hmm.
it's just the narrative focus that is privileging this one person, not that like they're the most important person in the world. To call out Seth Dickinson again, in The Traitor Bear Cormorant, there's this moment where Barrow is reminded by someone that there are other players on the board, meaning
Yeah.
that like it's not just your game. You don't understand everything that's happening. There are other things happening that you don't understand, and people are making their own moves. And with Raphael, I get that so strongly, right? That we don't know what's going on with her. We know very little about her. But this person who is both, as we've said, very kind, very driven, but is also is like attracted to the house in and of itself, right? And
Yeah.
has some kind of desire for whatever spiritually the house is doing. And goes there sometimes without Piranesi even, right? Yeah, I just love that idea of all these people kind of going on about their own business, and we get to see just these little tiny glimpses.
Yeah. And that she's another person who seems to be interested in the house for what it is rather than Lawrence Arnsale's claim that it will have some sort of immense power
Hmm.
that it will provide. Because
Hmm.
it seems like the people who lose their memories are the people who believe that there is some sort of material gain.
Hmm. Yeah. All right. What else do we want to say about Piranesi and puzzle
It's a
boxes and
perfect book.
mysteries? It's a perfect book. I don't say that super often. It is a
No.
perfect book. Uh, yeah, wouldn't change a word of it. I started this podcast because I wanted to do like more tough negative criticism. So of course I'm picking like the best books that exist. Yeah. And I said, don't change anything. Misha,
I mean, yes.
what else do you have going on? What are you excited about? What do you want to share with people before we close the episode?
Yeah, I mean, uh, hopefully after I finish this PhD, now I'm catching up on a bunch of reading and writing, more work with Ancillary review of books.
Hmm.
But the sort of major plug, I guess, that I would share is at mishagw.itch.io is where I publish games, and I have a big game coming out soon that is about
Oh,
being an immortal and trying to figure out what to do with all that time in a way that doesn't mess up the world.
awesome.
Um, so yeah, I hope people will be interested in that. And really, instead of doing anything else, they should just read Piranesi. But
Yeah. But oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, we'll make sure we get that in the show notes. All right. Well, thanks so much.
awesome.
We'll talk again about more stuff. But yeah, for
Yeah,
now, let's sign off. Thanks again for joining.
thank you.
A Meal of Thorns is a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books, an online magazine founded to address the radical possibilities of criticism, with a focus on speculative fiction, world literature, and utopian impulses. Go to ancillaryreviewofbooks.org for regular reviews, essays, interviews, and more. Our opening poem is by Barsha Hari, translated by John Bruff. Our music is by Giselle Gabriel Garcia. Our artwork is by Rob Patterson at The Ratio Farm. Apologies to Chiwetel Ejiofor, whose name I mispronounced. Ejiofor did the amazing audiobook narration for Piranesi, and I'm not good enough at sound editing to ADR that in without it sounding awful. If you'd like to support the podcast and the Ancillary Review of Books, that is rad. A few different ways you can do that. Subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/ancillary-review. That would be super cool of you. Check out our show notes for bookshop links. If you buy a book through there, the podcast gets a cut. Click like, click share, leave a comment or review wherever you find us. Tell someone you know to check us out. It really helps. Questions, suggestions, pedantic notes about things we got wrong? Drop us an email at mealofthorns@gmail.com. Join us next time for a discussion of C.S. Lewis's Paralandra with Taylor Driggers. And check out our site for a list of other upcoming books and guests. We've got some good ones on there. Thanks for listening.